I am Asha Dore with Parley Lit, and I'm here with Lance Olsen to talk about his books, Absolute Away and Always Crashing in the Same Car.
It's great to be here, Asha, and thanks very much for having me. So I'm Lance Olsen, and I've written a couple books about what might sort of fraughtly be called experimental fiction. And I've taught stuff about that for about 35 years or so, the last at the University of Utah. But most important is that I learned maybe 3 days ago that Norwegians say when asked, "How are you doing?" they often say up and not crying. And that just like delights me. I think that's like the coolest response ever. So now I'm saying that to everybody.
I love that, and I think it's a great introduction to our conversation today. I love your work so much. I've read a number of your books, and certainly in these two books we're talking about today, Absolute Away and Always Crashing in the Same Car, I identify vast existential explorations right beside a really pronounced playfulness in language and form. I looked up your list of books before this interview because I realized that I might not have read all of your books, and you have written something like 30 or 31 books, right?
I just love to write. And
Mhm.
so books keep growing. And I mean, sort of like with Always Crashing, with Absolute Away, something will spark an idea or a problem, and then I fall into that. And I love the idea of waking up every morning for 2 years and not knowing where I'm going and how to solve the next problem and so on. So these things have just built up behind me like barnacles on the wreck that I am. In general, we writers, tend to be like curious by nature. We tend to be like very present, like we're paying attention, and we tend to be, productively skeptical, which also leads to all sorts of possibilities in writing. And if you do that, how could you stop writing, right?
Absolutely. I think that's so true. Absolute Away is the most recent book, right? And then right
Yeah.
before that, Always Crashing in the Same Car came out. I love both of them. One of my favorite things in art is anything that emphasizes how expansive a moment can be. I feel that once you know that death exists, every moment is kind of this major expansion.
We have to talk about death for a second, because death is one of my favorite topics, because I really do think this too. Thomas Pynchon said something about real literature begins when people develop a serious perspective on death. And the only way you can do that is to live long enough so that you begin to feel death working from the inside out. And that is like so true. I felt like when I first started to write, I was a slow learner, and I didn't really grasp that that was true. I felt deeply that I was the exception to the rule. It was sad other people were going to die, but that was their problem. And then there's this moment where it's like, oh, I can feel my cells breaking down, or I have a good friend who died, and suddenly the tenor changes. You can't write, you know, fluffy, make us cozy kind of literature. You have to suddenly do something else,
Mhm.
and that's where the serious good stuff starts for me. I mean, if you look at all your favorite books ever, they're always at some level about ending, right? Because, okay, this is a weird idea, but it totally strikes me as true, is that really what novels teach, no matter how the plot arc goes, is that things end at the end. Like there's always a final period and a splash of white. And
Mhm.
that's really a deep structure lesson in the fact that all things end.
I love that. I've had two conversations kind of constantly lately that just keep bouncing through my life. And one of them is about how episodic TV is really soothing for our brain. There's all this evidence if we watch a crime show that we regulate our dopamine, and some people become addicted to that, beginning, middle, and end, like everything is resolved kind of thing. But I have also been talking to people about this book, The Grieving Brain. The person who wrote it talks about how we make this cartography of our life, and then when people die, we have to like remake the map, and that's sort of what grief is. It's just like it's sort of impossible to remake that map.
Grief is such a good example of that too, because one wants to like narrativize grief into a beginning, middle, and end, and then you're beyond it. And really, grief just keeps flying at us when we least expect it in these little shrapnel moments, and I think it's almost like those narratives you described, those episodic, those sitcom-y, rom-com-y sort of narratives are all designed to make us sort of not think about that,
Mhm.
to not make us feel like our life really just splashes at us non-narrativized. And if there's any kind of sense to be made, it's going to be our sense for limited periods of time until the next, shard of shrapnel
Mhm.
comes flying in. Death suffuses both of these novels. It's one of
Mhm.
the things that really connects both of them because, like with Bowie, like we're big fans. We're both big fans of Bowie. I adore Bowie. I fell in love with him when I was like 13, I think. The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars and then Diamond Dogs. And and there's that Bowie, and there's all sorts of stuff to talk about that. But the Bowie that like super interested me was the Bowie sort of kind of 90s and post 90s, where he no longer had to prove anything. He was getting older and like seriously older. Then he was getting sicker and then seriously sicker with liver cancer and, a number of heart attacks and all this sort of stuff. And his whole perspective changed because it was about him looking into himself as an older person beginning to face death from the inside out. And like his voice changes and his tenor changes. He gains a kind of wisdom in his interviews. And I love the fact that he allowed himself to enter that space, right? And
Mhm.
then, Absolute Away has to do with a different set of like what do you call it? Like a different theme of travel in ways we don't usually expect travel, right? So not just through space, but through all the selves we inhabit in a life, right? All the ideas that we flirt with and pass through and come out changed by or not changed by through gender. The very idea of gender is such sort of an unstable construct that's taken culture so long to kind of learn. And then through time and then into aging, like we're all immortal. And I always tell this, but like when I was in high school in 12th grade, I had everything figured out. And then the rest of my life has been this slow unraveling of any knowledge I thought I might have at some point had. And I
Mhm.
refer to that moment as beginning to age. Like that's what growing older is about. And I really, speaking of problems, I really wanted to explore that, both in Absolute Away and in a very different register in Always Crashing in the Same Car.
Yeah, I can see that. I love that. I love everything that you said. It's like all of these different Bowies were these public experiences of a person. And I think that that's so interesting to be able to sit back and not know who this person was at all, really, and make all of these stories and meaning from the things that he shared. Such an interesting way to be immortal.
Absolutely. And this idea, it was really interesting. I got into Bowie recently again, kind of the last 20 years or so, where he did those things that we're just talking about. And so I started to pick up biographies. And what was so cool was that like every biography created a different Bowie. Like that in itself proves that Bowie is just this kind of kaleidoscopic, chameleonic figure. And he always used to say he sort of propped up this cardboard Bowie outside his apartment door and then walked in and became the real Bowie, which none of us ever gets invited to. And I really respond to that idea of a figure that's a complete black box, and you were talking about the narrator of Always Crashing. He's an academic, and academics really want to stabilize knowledge, but really his education is a kind of unlearning into a Bowie that can't be pinned down. So he's left with only questions, and that strikes me as something very Bowie. Like I always, of course, always wanted to send Bowie a copy, but he was already, he had already changed tense, and so it was like, wouldn't it be cool to get his read on this? But who knows?
Right. Yeah. And I love how you talked about the unlearning, which is kind of similar to that unlearning that you were talking about as we as we age. I think that that's really valid. And I often really think a lot about the way that we try to make ourselves unbiased. I mean, like that's the point of this little thing that has become a podcast just came out of a good conversation at one of the plays that we put up about a review that had all this incorrect information, but still tried to make itself objective. And it's really weird that we try to divorce ourselves from subjectivity and feel like that puts us at a top of a hierarchy of knowledge. I don't understand that at all because our subjectivity is where our knowledge comes from.
I so deeply believe that. And, that hopefully there'll come a time when I know absolutely nothing. I'm rapidly approaching that time, but I think it's been funny because we could talk a little bit about this also in Absolute Away, but it was the same thing. It sort of launched with I love to do research. It launched with a sort of foray into research. And what research ever teaches me is how little people really know about a subject, right? I mean, the more you know about a subject, the more you can understand that you don't know anything about the subject. And Absolute Away, the sort of pivot there was reading so I went to MoMA one day. I was standing in front of a Jackson Pollock painting called Autumn Rhythm. And we've all had this experience where you pass a painting or you see a painting a million times, or you kind of know what a Pollock painting is or a Picasso or whatever. And then you like actually see it for the first time, rather than just like walk by it and bucket list it. And it was like, oh my God, I now understand how powerful this is. So I, of course, picked up a biography, started reading. There's this little paragraph in the biography about, Pollock was an alcoholic. He drove off the road one night with two women in the car, which I'll get to in a second. He died, one of the women died, and it was almost surely, I mean, as alcoholism so often is, a kind of slow suicide and then sped up at the end. But what was interesting about it was there was just this one little, not even a paragraph, there were like 3 sentences about this young woman in the back seat. And very little is known about her. Her name was Edie Metzger. And so I started to try to do some research. The only thing that's known about her, I just love this so much because it's all about unlearning. It's all about, research leading us down into more unlearning. She, as a little girl, was raised in Berlin. Her parents, and she was Jewish, her parents, who were sort of progressive Jews, took her to a Nazi rally just to sort of witness and have their child, who was barely 2, witness what this thing that was happening to democracy was like. And Hermann Goering mistook her for an Aryan because she had these apparently very blue eyes, picked her up, kissed her, and she bit his lower lip so hard that it bled. And that's like history. That's all. Then 20 years goes by, and she appears in the back of Pollock's car on the night he kills himself. In the front seat is Ruth Kligman, who he's having an affair with while his wife Lee Krasner is in Paris. Ruth is friends with Edie, who seems to live in New York, and they've been buddies for a while, but that's like all we know about him. And the idea that she sort of blipped into history as this 2-year-old, blips out, blips in again as this probably about 26-year-old, 24-year-old, and then dies. Just like blew my mind. Like that is her narrative. That's how it comes to us. That's who she was. And so, how can you not, as a writer, go like, who the hell was that? What was that about? Like, what would that life have been about had she continued to live, which is what part of the novel's also about. And so I keep jumping into problems only to get more problems. One of the things I really love to do is to write into gaps. I mean, history purports, because it's narrativized in a certain way, to lend coherence to our pasts, but it seems to me that actually, if you pay attention to history, it does just the opposite. And this is a perfect example where what history really is about, like, you literally can't get a birth date for her. You can get a death date. You can't get a job for her. You can't get an interiority for her, but you can place her where she was when she died. And like, so there's so many gaps. And it's the same thing with Bowie. There's so many gaps in his life. It's like, so what was he? You know, sometimes he was bisexual. Sometimes he was a neo-Nazi. Sometimes he was this like incredible, talented musician, but sometimes he was in Tin Machine, which put out really bad music. The love of his life apparently comes along, though we have no actual, like, besides, you know, public shots, right? PR shots, any sense of what life that was behind the closed doors. I mean, that, how can you not write about that? And not so much make sense of it, but make sort of an unsense of it, you know, and to kind of remind us all, in these sort of unfixable times, that you know, we're not alone in feeling those things.
In absolute a way, one thing that I love is just the way that there are these future moments and past moments and present moments and like quotes from people who have not lived yet, brought into moments that happened a long time ago, and just this stacking of time and understanding because the reader is here and now. And I feel like that's so much of how we actually understand the world. And it's really interesting to me because it seems like this opening up of curiosity and the way that we try to make meaning of each other. To me, one of the reasons that we're so isolated is because we often, I think, tell the story of another person, make a decision about that, and then kind of we just other all the time in all these ways that we're unaware of. Both of these books crack that apart and are like, actually, it can be all of these things maybe, so why not just ask the question instead of making the decision?
We're doing a Vulcan mind meld right now. Okay, so there are two ideas I wanted to bring up exactly off of these things. So the first thing is, there's this theorist whose name is Mikhail Bakhtin. Bakhtin has all sorts of narrative theory, but there's this little corner of his work that I just love, and it's about talking about what he talks about as unfinalizability. And he says that when we meet a text or when we meet a person, our instinct is to finalize them, to make them into a coherent, understandable whole, basically so that we can put them off to the side and move on with our lives, or judge them, or just like seal them off, right? That's that othering that you're talking about. But that in fact, what happens is that, you know, and we all know this intuitively, that the more you read books, like the same book, if you come back to You're a Different Person, it's a different book, you will find new things in it. It will never be finalizable. You'll never get to the last page. And with people, we know this all the time. If you actually open yourself up to other people, you realize, you know, Bowie's like the classic example. He's unfinalizable. You'll never get a fence around him. And that's the joy. Like, that's the joy to be found, is the fencelessness, not the other. And then the second point I wanted to make is this idea of, big word, small idea, anti-teleology. But so teleology is just having a belief about how endings happen. So we're moving through, you know, like people will say, oh, it all really makes sense, you know, it's all for a reason. Well, that suggests a teleology, that I'm living my life and I'm going to come to an end and it will all make sense. My experience of that has been fat chance. And so one of the problems I set myself up with, both in Bowie and in the Absolute Away, is the idea of an like, what would an anti-teleological narrative look like? What would a narrative look like that didn't believe that everything was going to add up to something? So people from the futures can be quoted in the now. People can be utterly contradictory and all the facts conflict and never resolve. That, you know, grief can be a perpetual state rather than a state that ties itself off and now we can throw it over our shoulder. And that opened up in both of these books a kind of vibrant space of writing for me, because they're books that won't settle. just like my experience of reality doesn't settle. And that to me is one of the reasons I think one of the ways I've gotten to where I am as a writer. I think of spaces of writing as spaces of contemplation for me, at the deepest level. Like, we're all telling a story, we're all doing this, we're all doing that. But I like to take something like, say, the idea of travel and say, so let me like think about that, and think about that metaphorically, right? Through Edie, through space, through time, through different characters, and then what have I learned about that by the end? And of course, as we said, or what have I unlearned about that? Because we've all been taught these things that we have to unlearn, spend the rest of our lives unlearning.
I'm resonating with everything you're saying. Like, I like what you said about, writing something that doesn't settle. I think that triptychs are an amazing form. I was a visual artist first.
Interesting.
Writing is doing what a painting does. Every time you're with it, something different happens to you. And that's one of the reasons I really like your writing, because I feel like sometimes I'll read 10 pages and then go back and read the same 10 pages. It's a totally different thing. I have already, the things that I've read have already cracked open something that led me to something else. And then I come back to it and it's a new thing. And that's what I think literature should do. I love it.
Okay, so we have to talk about painting for a second, especially through Jackson Pollock's eyes. So
Yeah.
Bowie was this incredibly great painter, but also about triptychs. And so with the painting thing, like, here's a very cool fact, and it kind of led into another way of I began to think about the novel. So Pollock adored jazz, and he would listen. He loved Coltrane, Miles Davis, and so on. And the problem he posed for himself, though I didn't realize this until I was reading his biographies, is what would jazz look like if it were on a canvas? And hence his action painting. And it was like, oh my God, that's freaking brilliant. And so then what I did, and I didn't know that fact until I posed the question for myself, what would a Jackson Pollock painting look like as a narrative? And but it's the exact same move. And it's like, if you take either of those and answer the question, you will not get to an end. You will not have a clean plot arc, and you will have that sense of action, energy, sort of this explosive power, and this sort of almost shrapnel effect. That, I mean, this really well, but that idea of Jackson Pollock sort of doing that swath of the brush splatter across the canvas, that, like, and then the idea of, like, how do you translate that? That is such a fascinating problem. And then triptych, I just wanted to bring up this point I've really been thinking about a lot lately, is form suggests philosophy. And sometimes we don't like think through that. And that idea of, you were talking about the episodic, the rom-com, whatever, suggests this philosophy of ease, that things can be resolved in fairly tight spaces, and that life could kind of like settle. And that neither of those is my experience. And so I'm really interested in forms that open into different kinds of thinking. And triptych is, people use them in different ways and so on. But in this absolute away notion of the triptych, it's all about different perspectives. It's all about different minds and temporalities. And it's all about like incommensurate ways of being in the world, Edie's versus the Nazis versus Pollock's, and all of that. I hope it functions to remind us that there's never a single voice or a single point of view or a single angle on truth, but just these sort of proliferations of ever shape-shifting truths. And then, having said that, which strikes one immediately as like, oh yeah, of course, there are lots of truths in the world. That's actually a very hard way to live. Right? It's so much easier to say there are lots of truths in the world and mine's right. But to say there are lots of truths in the world and I will never get to that sense of being right, I'll simply be able to further explore the multiplicity of those truths. And I think the structure of the novel actually of both novels, but I'm thinking of Absolute Way, really tries to live that in a way that I think, a lot of readers are like, oh my God, this isn't resolving like it's supposed to resolve.
I think that's joyful though. I love that. And Always Crashing in the Same Car, the way that that works with memory and just like shifting even one person's memory. There's just a lot of mentions of even Bowie not remembering what he said in interviews and not remembering, it seemed to me like different selves and different ways of being in the world, which I think is something that for me resonates already with me and I imagine with most people, but something that we don't really think about very often. It's like, yeah, I was kind of a different person back then, but I don't even remember actually what the way I thought had a different texture. And just understanding that like our perspective is actually never fixed, even if we think it is. So we really can't have our one point of view.
Even the way you were saying that, I was thinking, yeah, and like, because we almost pretend that we remember who we were as a 6-year-old, but like that was a different, like literally that was a different person. Our cells are different.
Yeah.
Our experience of the world is different. What do we really remember of the memory we think we're having, and what do we sort of fill in the gaps, right? With little fictions that make that moment feel real. And then, I have sisters, and whenever we sit down and talk about our childhoods, where were you guys? I was like, I had a totally different sense of that experience, or I have no recollection that ever happened. And I think none of us want to realize just how fallible memory is, right? And how just about the time because we're all so busy narrativizing our own lives to make them make sense, that indeed those memories are narrativized moments, not lived moments that we actually lived. That blows my mind. And somebody like Bowie, I think was very conscious because he wasn't only like having problems at the level of mnemonic, but he was also having problems about like who he was that week. He wanted to be everybody. He wanted to perform everybody. He wanted to be nobody so that nobody could, pin him down. So he was always changing. So he was like living, how to say this? He was the metaphor for what we all live, right? We really all are doing that. He just made a sort of career out of reminding us of that.
Yeah, he did. It's amazing. One of the reasons I love him. I also just like as a side note, I'm just always impressed with people who carry their art from the beginning until the end and just
Yeah.
continue to produce. A lot of people just crumble. I don't know why, but it's after being really productive.
Sort of the Picasso problem too, where it's like one of the things I admire so much about Picasso is he just kept reinventing himself. Like he just would get like he would turn 90 and he would be like, yeah, no, I need a new style. And that, and Bowie, as we were saying, it was, and especially like in his early years, but even in the later, he would do this thing. I love this so much that, he would live in New York. He dressed in this really shabby way where he could become invisible in a crowd. He would show up at this jazz bar that's it's really crowded space in the village, and he would be and he would just lose himself in the back. And if he liked somebody who was playing, instead of doing that thing of like, I'm Bowie, he would just go up and go, I just really loved what you were playing. I need you to bring your music into my music so that I can learn more about my own music. Would you like be up for that? And I would be like, oh my God. So he's conceiving of creation as an act of collaboration as opposed to an act of narcissism. And, the guy's in his 50s. It was like, he didn't need to do that, but that's who he had become. I love that so much.
It's wonderful. The lack of narcissism for somebody who I think portrayed himself as like a pretty significant narcissist when he was younger.
But kind of like growing through that. And this goes to a larger point about writing these days too, because so much is driven by this kind of, what do you call it, stock market aesthetics, where, it's like this guy's stocks are up, this person's stocks are down. This can make a lot of money. And it's like, oh my God, to be able to interest space where we're not in competition, but in collaboration, and where, as we all know, I mean, we all really know this as writers, nobody wins. Or everybody wins, but it's not like they're winners and losers. It's we're all in this for different reasons, and we're all in it at different points in our lives and all that. But I love the idea of, reaching out and helping each other. Like, what bad happens from that? And also being influenced. Like a lot of people won't show their influences in their writing, or won't talk about their influences. And like, all I do is pick up books that I hope will like wake me up and change me in some way and teach me something I haven't learned to this point, or unlearned by this point. And then, I madly go up on social media and tell other people about it, because, well, that's awesome. That's so great. Like, that's what we should all be doing.
I don't know what happens after we die, but I don't really care to know. I don't think it matters. Like, we are here, and the joy is being in this, because we're all dying and we're gonna die, and then we don't know. And so who cares? And I feel like so much of our way of, doing that self-narrative and narrativizing everything and writing books and watching TV is all just about kind of like preparing for the next thing,
Mhm.
instead of
Totally.
being, it's and it's so interesting too that we were like talking about form, because the triptych, or any kind of form, to me is just like the box, kind of like death, that like allows you to be in awe of your life if you accept that it's happening and that there might not be an after. It's like if you just stay into the joy of and the awe of the box that you're in and just do it, then that's great. But if you're like kind of trying to plan for this future after thing, whatever might happen, Heaven's Gates or being a New York Times bestseller, it doesn't really matter. It's just not being in the awe of the art of it.
Absolutely. My latest thoughts on death and corporate publishing, I think, is that both embody a nostalgia for a future that will never exist.
Yes.
Um,
That's a
and,
good
and and it's like, I have no, and but not only whole people, but whole cultures base how they operate on assumptions about that nostalgia that won't happen. It's like, you have no proof, you have no
Mhm,
evidence, you have no lived experience, you just have narratives that tell you this is going to happen or that's going to happen. And like, you say, I mean, we're not going to be there at our deaths. Like, something's going to happen, and then something else is going to happen or not.
mhm,
Why would you fashion your whole life about that moment rather than all the moments that lead up to that moment, right? With the
mhm.
awareness of that moment. That to me is so much nicer, And then in corporate publishing, like you say, the New York Times bestseller, it's like, your chances of winning a lottery are going to be just like so much higher than becoming a New York Times bestseller. So if you want the money and fame, like, do the lottery thing and then write
Yeah.
what you care about, right? Write why you write. Um, and also, like, why would you, this is just me complaining, but like, why would you adopt a form that is somebody else's way of thinking,
Right.
instead of try to find the form that is your way of thinking? And do I know my way of thinking? No, it'll change all the time. So then
Mhm,
the form will change all the time, right? That's like beautiful. And like you say, awe, right? That you can take awe in that moment that it's changing again.
mhm.
And that you're seeing things in ways that you hadn't seen before, and that we're waking up in ways that we didn't know we really could. That's awesome.
Yeah, it is, and it's like that unsettled thing, like, to me, that's great. Like, I think that's why we're alive, to be unsettled, like, to be curious and to not know. It's just,
Yeah.
like, the best thing. Like, I love it when I think I know something and someone says something and I'm like, "Oh, shit." Like, I didn't know that at all. It's, like, amazing. It's, like, great. Now I get to go back and figure out why I thought that for so.
Well, actually, I think that's the definition of being alive. And
Yeah.
I think a lot of people have, different ways of being dead.
Mhm,
And of, and I understand, like, I say that, and I don't in any way mean it in a condescending way, but it's like, watching those rom-coms, watching those neatly constructed detective stories, or thrillers, it's like they give you that impression of settling that that is exquisitely important, because on the other side of that, it's really scary.
Mhm.
And to like investigate the other side of that, you're always back on your heels. You're always disoriented, you're always low grade anxiety is creeping in at the heels. You're always confronted with huge questions like death, right? Or
Yeah.
like, what does being alive feel like? And it's like being alive feels like a lot of things at once. You can't. I mean, one of the tricks of language is that it creates sentences, and so it gives you the impression that this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. But indeed, life is like this run on, and it's just all these things at once. We were talking about grief and joy and awe and pain and anxiety. Those aren't things that are sequential. It's like, yeah, that's my daily routine. And, and that's great. So how do you write to capture that?
Yeah, I think that's so true. And it makes me think about, in absolute a way, Edie probably was not planning to die the day that she died. And I think that that's sort of like the lesson of people who die young. When we can view that and observe that, we can kind of go, okay, one, what you did with the end of the triptych, like, all the different things that Edie could have become or could have been, I think is something that is just embedded in our perception of someone dying too young, in our opinion, which I think was just wonderful and like a delightful thing. But also, just the looking at someone's life and going, did you live your life? Or were
Mhm.
you just doing the thing for the next thing? Like, did you actually go into this space, accept that expansion that you were talking about of just like all of these things are happening? Or were you living inside of the sentence and the way that we try to control time in sequence with our weird brains? And
And worse, living inside somebody else's sentence,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And that's what I see, so many people doing. I'm always warning my students to not like shrug on the narratives that other people have given you, to always try to invent your own sentence or your own narrative. And I said, it's terrifying. Like, to actually take up my challenge is going to be the most, terrifying thing you do in your life, because it's not done once, it's done like every 5 minutes, and you never resolve into one thing. You resolve into the next many things and the next many things and the next many things, but you'll never feel more awake.
Mhm.
You'll never feel, more there, which, really, I mean, it's so funny because, I've been around so long now that it's like that in itself is startling. But then to look back and think that really is like one of the things that I've most unlearned about things is not to shrug on all the sentences of others, and to accept that sense of anxiety as a mode of productive being, as opposed to a mode of like somehow that's a bad thing and I need to to do something or to take something or to write a certain way to make that go away, rather than go, oh no, that's part of the chord. Like human is being all these notes in this really dissonant chord, and you want to be all those notes. That's being fully human.
I'm a speech pathologist. Speech pathology is kind of like a study in linguistics and in the disorganization and dysfunction of language. And just when it breaks down, how do we help people like function in the world? And so it's a really interesting way of seeing language. I have never seen language as like a transparent thing. Ever since I was little, it just bothered me that people were very certain about what like words meant or
Mhm.
about what each other were saying or what each other meant. It's just something that I would just sit there and observe and be like, but how do you know that? Because that word could mean this in this situation. And, so I just kind of went to grad school to figure out what I thought about that. And it's been really interesting because the whole thing with allied health based on language is like accepting that language is not transparent
Mhm.
at all, and like really just trying to teach other people who may or may not have language disorders that it isn't transparent, be okay with that, live in a world where like your language is not going to represent you the way that you thought it did. And
Mhm.
like we identify with the way that we talk, the way that we think, the words that we use so much without thinking that we do. And yet we're always trying to modify to sound a certain way or be a certain persona. This like way of we reinvent ourselves without acknowledging that we're reinventing ourselves with language all the time. you know?
Absolutely. My way of thinking about that is that meaning always means more than it means to mean. So whatever you say is not the thing necessarily that you mean or that I hear
Mhm.
or that any 10 people would understand. And instead of seeing that as a kind of fractured zone, see it as this kind of zone of possibility.
Yeah.
And I think that's where a lot of us actually writers come from.
Mhm.
I know, like I fell in love with words really early on. I fell in love with phrasing really early on. This kind of musicality of language. Once Truman Capote picked on Jack Kerouac by going, that's not writing, that's typing. And and it was like, exactly, like what do we do? What do we writers do that nobody else does? Well, one of the things is cherish language, but ironically cherish the very ambiguity that's built into language and understand that you don't you don't clarify that. It does, like you say, it doesn't get transparent, so it gets like beautifully oblique,
Yeah.
but and beautifully filled with potential. So it must be, this is a strange question for you, but it must be like so interesting to listen if you're working in speech pathology to that, like be reaffirmed every day.
Yeah. It's well, and also the way that people fight it is really interesting to me. Like, and finding ways to tell people that that's real without giving them like a, dissertation on what the word transparency means when we're talking about linguistics, just kind of like, eh, and a lot of people have aphasia or their children who are children, and so just finding ways to actually like tell people that it's okay. You can be okay with not knowing and with people not understanding you.
Mhm.
It and it's just like and having your own way of saying things, like saying it with different sounds than other people might expect, or using an iPad to communicate for you, or whatever it is, like, it's okay to be different. Kind of to what you were saying about, like, living in other people's sentences, I think that it's just so interesting that we think that we are following a model when we are definitely always not,
Well,
no
and
matter what we
celebrating the unmodel, right?
yeah.
Which is so. I'm thinking as you're talking about Gertrude Stein sentences, and it was so. I took a psychology course. I started to major in psychology, and then I hit statistics, and that was the end of that. But
Yeah.
in my first psychology class, on the first day of class, I still like so vividly remember this. The professor put up two passages. One was the dictation off of a hebephrenic, schizophrenic, and the other was a Gertrude Stein paragraph, and said, what are the differences between these? And the long and the short of it is there are no differences. It was simply that Gertrude Stein celebrated what she could do with language.
Mhm.
And the explosive power that she gave to language, because not only did she see the world utterly um, differently than most of us, but also was able to capture that. But by reading her, we can't do anything other than see the world utterly differently than we did before we started to read her.
Mhm.
And I felt like such a richer person for understanding that. And it sounds like so much of what you're talking about with speech pathology actually is are other ways of um, saying that idea. And so do you see other connections between speech pathology and sort of your act of writing?
Absolutely. I so allied health has taught me it's so funny because I feel like the words allied health sounds so bleak, and also like speech pathology or language pathology also like the most bleak phrase that probably exists when we're talking about language. It's like we're pathologizing language. but I feel like, the way that I understand the books that I love and the way that I believe other writers are writing is really similar to like therapeutic principles, because when we are trying to learn something, like if somebody has aphasia and they're trying to learn, vocabulary that they have lost or something like that. So it's very similar to like what we do with children, but harder for adults. Because with children, when we learn a word, right, like we have the word like milk or something, we have like a bazillion reference experiences. And then at some point, our brains, we have like enough reference experiences. We've created enough connections and constellations that we generalize the word milk so that anything that looks like milk or could possibly be conceived as milk is probably going to seem like milk to us. And we'll be able to like attach to that. And so it's just when we're, fixing that, we have to try to kind of create these constellations of meaning for people, right? So it's like, this is milk. This is also milk. That video over there, of somebody drinking a glass that looks like milk, probably milk. That thing coming out of a cow's udder, also milk, you know? And then, the idea is to then use that word in a bunch of different circumstances functionally so that it generalizes. And I feel like the writing that I like and the writing that I try to do layers meaning like that. It's like I have an idea or a problem to solve. And so I'm just gonna like layer it and layer it and layer it until I feel satisfied.
Mhm.
And that's what I like. And it's unsettling because I don't reach an end either. So
But that's awesome because really then what you're providing somebody with is this rich, dense sort of you know, cake of possibility of meaning, and it also has, because of the result of creating that, you're inviting the reader into this textured space that's all about how to read, how to make sense, how sense can't be made, all those things that we've been talking about, and into this kind of realm of creating possibilities for meaning rather than saying, it's this, or this. And that's the kind of writing that I adore coming across because it makes life more complicated.
Mhm.
It makes living more complex. And man, if there's anything I've gotten to by this point in my life, it's that they're just complexity is the answer to everything. It just doesn't get simple and transparent. And but it's beautiful. Like that is beautiful. To that experience is so much more, vivifying than sitting there reading a newspaper.
The thing that we're talking about, and one of the things that I just really love about Absolute Away is the titled sections. Like I feel like the titled sections for me do that kind of layering where it's like that's why when I go back to read it, I'm hit at different levels because it just seems like there's just this, you know, I feel like titles do a thing where they kind of tell you what you're about to read unless the writer is doing something different. And so they're always a question for me. It's like a little question, like, is this a question that I'm supposed to answer or that you're going to answer for me in this section? And I love that like inquiry based reading kind of, or I'm being taught to read with inquiry. And that's how I take it. And I love that so much.
Well, and it goes back to what we were just saying. It like in the best of all worlds, it activates the reader in ways that sort of brings a self-consciousness to the reading process. And my titles, and thank you so much for paying attention to them. Sometimes they jibe with what's coming up.
Mhm.
Sometimes they work against it. Sometimes they're off in left field somewhere. And all of them turn, a moment into a kind of lyricism. And all of that goes to, these all appear in the first section, which is little girl Edie's. She's barely coming into consciousness. She's maybe, late twos. And what I wanted to do, because my impression of kids at that age is that the world actually happens to them just like we've been describing it, and they haven't been taught that it doesn't happen that way, right? So the world's just all these little flickery images coming in and sense impressions and, bright splinters of stuff. And they're all sort of awesome because, the kids are trying to like narrate it into meaning, but things are happening that just don't have a meaning. They're just magic. And I wanted for the first section to capture a consciousness that is most definitely not mine, but I think is all of ours at some stage until we sort of are taught to grow out of that and stop being childish. One of the things that all artists share is this kind of childlike wonder.
Mhm.
And we haven't had it knocked out of us yet.
Mhm.
And I wanted to capture that sense. Okay, ironically, she's at a Nazi book burning, but she doesn't see it that way. She sees like beautiful flames and flickery lights and doesn't understand anything that's being said around her. And all she knows is that, maybe I love my father more. Maybe I love my mother more. Oh, now my
Mhm.
dad's picking me up. So now I love him more.
Mhm.
Oh, crap. Now he just put me down and now I'm going to have a tantrum because I get a I do that. And that sense impression thing, I wanted to do that
Mhm.
and then wanted to like, they're very short, as these very sort of short lyric sections to capture these like little bursts of experience, which is how I imagine little kids sort of experience their world. It's the best of times, it's the worst of times,
Mhm.
and now I forgot what I was worried about 2 seconds ago. And this is like awesome.
Mhm.
That was really fun to write. And then, that section goes into Jackson Pollock's, which is, fraught in such a different way and charged with emotion. And, you're talking about time and time dilates in that section. So it's probably, 15, 20 minutes to happen. And yet, it stretches and stretches and stretches. Whereas Edie's just this little momentless moment, this momentless moment.
Mhm.
And I really enjoyed inhabiting those spaces because they're so different.
Mhm. Yeah, it seems like each of the triptych panels are like a different kind of shattering, like a different way to shatter knowledge and life and time. And I just like it remind this is a really weird reference, but it reminded me of Francis Bacon's triptych, like just
Sure.
because it's like I don't even know what the hell I make of his work. I love it, but it's so weird, but I think it's just like something is remade here. And I don't know what it is, but it's like so fun to go into it and wonder what it is. And I love that each one I sort of like learned from the first that the next was probably going to be broken up. Plus it's a Pollock thing, so I've just had this expectation of like the splatter paint narrative coming, you know.
Absolutely. Oh my God. And Francis Bacon, I mean, that the triptych is such a great example. Um, I read a piece about it once that talked about it's like primary move is narrative jamming. And so you want to put a narrative on it, but it jams your attempt to put a narrative on it. And it's that fraught space of I understand it, I don't understand it, I understand it, I don't understand it, that creates, and of course the vision itself of it, which is like, I want, is that pain? Is that fear? Is that some kind of like existential epiphany? Is that, what is that happen? Is that meat? Is that a human? Um, and that's exactly right. That's that novel of anti-teleology too. It's that thing that won't settle for you. And you go back to it like 50,000, like I am so attracted to work like that
Mhm,
or a Pollock action painting because you really do like fall into them
mhm.
in ways that who you are on Tuesday will give you a different reading than who you are on Thursday. And that's so exciting. I'm so glad you thought of Francis Bacon in any way, shape, or form in relationship to anything I've ever done. Now I can face death, whatever happens on the inside.
Yeah, gosh, I love triptychs. To me, it's just this. beautiful container for a mess that I feel like you can like invite people who might not be okay with the mess because there's the container of like the sections that have like an expected routine or form or craft that like gives them that regularity, so they'll like accept all the other chaos.
Yeah, I like that. But it functions differently than that well-made, novel. It
Mhm.
functions very much as a receptacle for chaos.
Yeah.
Uh, but it creates the illusion, right? I don't know why humans are drawn to the number three, but
Yeah.
there's something about that threeness that gives it that sense of, okay, there's there's pattern. Like we're
Mhm.
pattern recognition machines, we see the pattern. But the thing that we're seeing, think of Bacon, is not a pattern. So
Mhm.
it's housed in a pattern but the thing that's housed is the non-pattern.
Mhm.
And that creates a kind of tension, right? Whether you're viewing or reading, because you're trying to create relationships, right?
Mhm.
So like in Absolute Away, there are relationships to be had, but they're very open relationships. They're not like one-to-one relationships, and they don't move the way you expect them to. And the styles are very different in each of the parts of the triptych. And I think that again sets us back on our heels as readers or viewers in very productive ways, right? In ways that make us want to re-enter the text rather than to be pushed out of the text. Though I know from experience that also people feel pushed out of the texts like that, and that's a shame.
Mhm.
But that's one of the reasons we write too, is to find the limits of people's ability to.
I think I can see that too. And it just reminds me that in Always Crashing, this one section like really got to me about David Bowie's Hermione, the way that grief brings us both into and out of our life, the way that missing people and like that way of like narrativizing a relationship where it's not, again, no beginning, middle, and end necessarily, but just kind of a haunting, which I think kind of is also in Absolute Away. It's just like these hauntings of connection with people, which is unfortunately maybe how we actually, I think, experience relationships. It's just we have this brief period of time with someone. We don't know when it's going to begin and we don't know when it's going to end and we don't know how we're going to deal with it at all. But we try really hard to make plans.
Yeah, that's so beautifully put. And Ashley, and for your listeners, Hermione was David Bowie's first big love.
Mhm.
And you would think Bowie, who like burned through thousands of people, many of them groupies, you would think he would long ago have forgotten what a Hermione was. Not at all. She tracked him through and haunted his whole life. And actually in the video for Where Are We Now, he's actually wearing the t-shirt of the movie that she left him to be in, 60 years before, 55 years before. And so, it's such a haunting sort of thing. Schopenhauer has this great observation that when we first meet somebody and shake their hands, we think we're just arriving and inviting ourselves into their lives, but what we're really doing is taking the first act of saying goodbye. And it was like, oh my God, well, that screwed up my day. But there is something about, right, that notion of like so many hellos are actually the beginning of goodbyes.
Mhm.
And even, like you're saying, say, let's call it the Hermione theory. And then these goodbyes aren't really goodbyes. They're these absences that are very present for the rest of our lives. That's that and it's that sense of ghosting, that sense of haunting is such a powerful human concept. And grief is such a beautiful way of thinking about that thing that is always there, that is always not there, that'll never leave you, that you want to have leave you, but you don't really want to have leave you, that hurts, but also that makes you feel alive.
Mhm.
Amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of like the whole thing about, like, the end. Like, we're always living and we're always dying and we're always saying hello and we're always saying goodbye. It's just like it could be an experience of awe. To me, that's like the choice, and that's what the
Yeah.
stories that operate in the ways that your stories do remind me to, like, make that choice. And to, like,
Continuously.
yeah,
Yeah.
like the way that David Bowie reminds us to also make that choice over and over. This has been so wonderful to talk to you and learn more about these books, and I love them so much.
It's been like such a blast. We could do this like for the next, oh, I don't know, 8 days.
Is there anything else that you would like readers to know?
Just up and not crying. I think that really summarized, like that was the perfect thesis statement and the perfect conclusion to our conversation. Words to live by. So this is going to be a passage from Always Crashing in the Same Car after David Bowie. And it takes place on the opening night of the musical that he was involved with called Lazarus on December 7th, 2015, 34 days before his death. And it goes like this. The nightly news shows a glossy black SUV pulling up to the New York Theater Workshop for the musical's opening. The predictable herding, the hoots, the raised cell phones, the camera flashes, a glitter of insults. The car door swings open, and the bodyguards spill out around the couple, Iman leading the way, the man trailing 6 or 7 steps behind. The nightly news shows the man's gray hair, having overtaken his sandy brown, cut close, like an accountant's, stubble-length sides, the antithesis of anyone's idea of stylish. Now, notice for a moment how much the nightly news misses. It neglects to show, by way of illustration, the rubble the man's immune system has become. It neglects to point out the 34 days left inside him. Only 15 seconds long, the footage of his arrival at the New York Theater Workshop moves too fast to follow in any detail. You have to slow it down, blow up each instant on your screen before you can begin to see what's going on. Look, there, how forced the man's smile is. Closer, how his teeth protrude negligibly as his sick gums recede. He isn't wearing makeup any longer. His pasty skin appears almost translucent in patches. Look at the pallid green vein near his left temple, the age spots on his left cheek. Look at his neck. Remark how slender it has become. Look at his ears. Remark how large they have grown. See his skinny legs, his wide feminine hips, how he carries his head inappreciably forward this evening, reminiscent of a professor in his 80s. How his gait is off, a scarcely noticeable lumber having invaded it. Now, who is he? Who is this man? This is the man moving across a brief stretch of opening night. Yet for him that brief stretch is boundless and radiant with adoration, fascination, those flashes, that continuous cell phone scintillation. And what is this man thinking? He is thinking every step is a battle. Observe how he avoids meeting the eyes of his fans, how he bores down on the entrance to the theater, closing the gap between him and it as quickly as possible. And what is the saddest sight in these 15 seconds? There, how painstakingly he clutches a small bottle of water to his stomach with both hands, like it might slip out of his grip and into another reality if he isn't careful, as the bodyguards barrel him through the covey of onlookers, many fewer than he may have expected. not hundreds, not scores, but playing the footage over and over, you count at most 30. Now, who is he? Who is this man? What can you determine he is not forgetting repeatedly? You can determine he is not forgetting repeatedly that the future will fail to include him. He is imagining every territory he will not inhabit, all the people, the books, the crucial objects that will burn to the ground. What else does the nightly news omit? The nightly news omits what occurs when our plots slow down, when those mechanisms that drive them, combat, acclaim, evasion, promise, pain, lose their urgency, their scope, diffuse into the lives we all in truth occupy, if steadily less and less. The nightly news does not show that the only thing separating one human being from another is, ruthlessly, the architecture of the body. How a man, upon their return home from the opening that Monday evening, will need to help her husband undress, help him urinate, help wipe up the spatters on the floor around the toilet. The nightly news does not describe how touching the man's skin feels to his wife. Is it warm, cool, soft, parched, busy with too many reminders? Nor what runs through her thoughts as she does so. The nightly news does not record what crosses her mind when she kisses him good night and recalls that nowadays he tastes of decay. The nightly news does not describe the scent of the couple's sheets, the firmness of their mattress, whether tonight the man will sleep there or, out of kindness for her, out of an appreciation for his wife's need for hush, among the pillows and quilts on the mattress in the panic room, listening to the high-pitched whine of his own nerves firing. It does not show the dream the man will chance upon with the help of a sedative. Both his lungs all at once beginning to glow in his chest, through his ribs and flesh, blurry balls of light as he stands by the window, and how that light swiftly expands to engulf him, and then the living room, and then the city, and then the universe. What the man will make of that dream when it wakes him inside the hour of the wolf. How, lying there, mulling it over, the man will hope one day to understand it. The nightly news does not show what he feels as these reflections traverse his synapses at 270 miles per hour. What is the man experiencing? What is he experiencing now? And now,